I don't know if you can hear, there's some really lovely bird songs going on outside. It's really nice. Good morning. I'll get the date right this morning because I made a mistake yesterday. It's the 20th. I'm just going to make sure. Is it? It is, isn't it? It's Sunday, the 20th of January 2019. So far, so good. Maintaining a daily commitment to writing and blogging about it after restarting yesterday, and after after having started the year prior. Not that I need to go into the full history. I talked about that yesterday. So the main outcomes of this morning were further planning of what this new version of beach surgery is going to be. I went for a really nice walk yesterday afternoon around a park that's nearby, and it's one of my favourite places to walk, and I really hadn't done it for a couple of weeks, I guess. And I went over there with my dog, and I've got a new habit that I've been implementing recently, where I'm doing things a bit more analog. So I have a bottle of water that I carry with me in my bag all the time now because I'm trying to drink more water this year. So it's actually the same size and width as a book, with the book behind it. It's like this A5 bottle of water, which is not really that important except to say that I'm carrying that around a lot to drink water, and I'm carrying a new notebook with me. I used to really exclusively just write in notebooks in my younger days, and then I moved on to iPads and computers, and I've been doing a few more sort of analog things lately, making music away from the computer using more analog tools, and now writing more. So I wrote an essay the other week on special education, and I did that completely within this notebook. And yesterday, when I went for a walk, I thought about some things that I wrote. I sat in an abandoned bowling club on the green with my dog, and wrote some things that have now this morning become things that I wanted to expand upon when doing this morning writing session. And so I guess the two key things that I worked on, one was some of the realizations of the key themes that I'm addressing within the book. I think I had some themes that were interesting that I was working on in the first iteration of the novel, but I think really one of the tipping points for me in terms of this new version of the book that I'm working on was a realization that it wasn't necessarily as historically connected to the moment as I'd now like it to be. And I've always had a bit of a funny relationship with books that try to be timely and try to capture the zeitgeist and talk about moments in history, because I think it can date them at times. It can date them in ways that aren't terribly flattering, but they can be quite hard to go back to and get into if they're too much of a particular moment. But then, that's also the value in some books to carry a particular resonance and to talk to the moment. So it really depends on what the book is going for. Something like Samuel Beckett, I love because I think it straddles both of those at the same time. On the one hand, its language is universal and almost without place at times, and just speaks to the essence of being human. But then there's another component which is very localised and very much of its time. I was thinking this morning about one of the last stories that Beckett wrote, Company, in which he gives little anecdotal memory moments of his past. And while they're not particularly referencing anything that's of the time of his youth, like of the early, say, 1900s, they are nonetheless very much capturing a particular sense of that time, just because you know Beckett and you know when it was written. So memories of him standing on a high space, looking down at the water, and his father encouraging him to jump in from a height. There's a memory of him walking along a road with his mother, and he looks up at the sky and says I think he said at first he says it's farther away than it looks, and that it's closer than it looks, and she is very displeased at that thought. But there are moments where they are not mentioning any particular technologies or particular historical moments, and yet just the act of walking down a street and holding the hand of a mother, or the act of being with a father, looking down, jumping into the water, it just feels like a particular time. It feels like a less busy time, a less urban time, a more rural experience often. And I mean, that's also because of some of the contextual markers around that. I'm thinking of another memory in that book where he talks about his mother giving birth and his father, sort of going for a walk or a drive, I think, while that's going on, just to get out of there, while the birthing is taking place, and again has a very country rural aspect. The descriptions of, and they're very simple, very very brief descriptions of the people involved, but it just gives a sense of the time, and I like that. And I think bringing that back to what I'm talking about is I've found particular themes that I'm really interested in now, that I do think about in other parts of my life, in my professional life, in personal life, to do with the moment that we're in, to do with, not to go into it all now, but I guess our particular relationship to ourselves and others, and technologies and history and progress, and the way that we relate to those things. And there's things that I do want to say about that, and that I want to explore in the world of a novel, without making it so much about the current moment. So not necessarily doing, say, sort of almost like Bret Easton Ellis hyper descriptions of products and brands and things that comprise a very particular moment, like almost a particular year. I think it's got to not be quite that, at least what I'm going for. It needs to be able to conjure up a particular time and moment, this present moment in lots of ways, while having a universality around it that doesn't date it completely, so that it's just a particular product of a very particular time. So those are some of the things I guess I'm thinking about, is the themes, the values of the book that I really want to have resonate both on a very temporal moment and a very universal moment. Things that I wasn't considering as much on the first version of Beach Surgery, but are very, very present now, which is excellent and is very necessary to what I'm going for. And the second thing that I was thinking about on the walk that I then took time to write about this morning was about the building blocks that will comprise the different chapters of the book, which is something that on a structural level, because of the way I'm structuring the book now, which I'm thinking about it in 3 different layers, which will become more apparent when the book is finished, I know, but I guess in the previous version of Beach Surgery, there was just one layer. There was just the singular narrative taking place between Katita and Leif. But in this new version, that is just one layer of 3 layers of the book, and I was wondering about how to write the book so that the layers were apparent but not so brutally distinct that one layer cut off and another layer started without there being some overflow between those sections, which is what I wanted. I wanted a more fluid experience, so the layers weren't so explicitly realised, that they were more something that I knew about but were not so visible within the novel. And I think that's something that I resolved last night after having had a few days or even a few weeks of sort of wondering just how I do that. So the way I'm going to do it is through thinking about the building blocks, the components that comprise each monologue or each chapter of the book, and each of those components will have things, will represent things that cross in between those different layers. I'm not saying that very clearly. Say one of the components is the beach surgery narrative, so it's about Katita and Leif. In some monologues of the book, that will be very dominant. That component will be 90% of the monologue, and 10% will be other components. But in other monologues, those that comprise other layers of the book, the beach surgery blocks, those components will exist within those other layers as well, but maybe only as 10% of the monologue. So they won't be as dominant, but they will still exist to preempt and call back to that beach surgery narrative. And those components will cover lots of other things too. There'll be components of psychogeography, components of memories, components of thinking about others in my life, and as they will become sort of fictionalized characters within the book. But there will be, and I've done this, I used to do this years ago. I don't know if this will help to visualize a bit more of what I'm saying, but when I used to plan the writing of songs that I would write, or stories that I'd write at the time, I used to use something like Microsoft Excel to have different cells on a page, and in some instances I would have a color code, like I might have like a key that says red. Say we're talking about, no, I won't talk about music. Say we're talking about writing. Red would be when I want to describe particular things, like I might be doing particular descriptions of nature. Yellow might be a particular philosophical thought that I want to talk about. Green might be a real sort of action-driven narrative part of the scene. Blue could be a dialogue between characters, and then I would structure it out in the Excel document where I might go blue, red, green, blue, yellow, yellow, red, and have the structure of what I thought would be an interesting way to pace the story. So we might have some narrative, some description, some philosophical digression, some description, back to narrative, back to dialogue between characters. And I always thought that was an interesting way to stand back and structure something that it didn't have to necessarily be that precise in the completed construction of the piece, but it just gave a bit of a marker to thinking rather than just sitting down and writing and seeing where the thoughts go, and then you look at it later and think, well, I've spent 4,000 words talking about something that I've probably laboured for much too long. I should have had some other things in there, and rather than necessarily going back to bolt in those things later, which can make a bit of an awkward patchwork of text, I think if you plan that from the start a bit, you've got a better chance of having the sort of variance, having the sort of structure that you like. You could probably see how it would work better, or not better, work more naturally with music, which is where I started doing it, with structural ways of doing that, where you might, I guess it's almost like notation, isn't it? Like you might even have it sort of go horizontal across the page, where I might, again, you're using colours. Blue might be particular drums and percussive elements. Red could be particular harmonies, say some string instruments, and you would paste them across the horizontal, and they might grow in size and reduce and disappear and come back, but you'd have a structural visual notation element. So that's what I'm thinking of in terms of how I'm thinking about the new structuring of this new version of Beach Surgery with these components. So a component might be psychogeography, where I talk about reflections on the physical environments that I'm in, and some of the considerations that come from that connect with the broader narrative. Another component might be reflections on a particular person, and I think I want to make sure that component of reflections on a particular person is not something that I just think about later and try to include or bolt in later, but it does very purposefully structure in at certain times across the narrative. One of the building blocks would be Beach Surgery, where Katina and Leaf come in and do their thing. So, and like I said, say in the first monologue of the book, that component may just be 10%. The Beach Surgery component might be 10% of the monologue. There might be 30% of the time describing the particular narrative trajectory that's happening within that monologue. 20% might be some psychogeography to help set the scene. 20% might be, I'm trying to think of what other components I had. I'm going a little blank. I think I need some breakfast. I don't want to talk about all of these because it gives away the book, but you can see what I'm talking about. Say another component is about the games that we play in our mind. So it might be talking about different mental games that we play. So that would be, say, a 10% component of that section. In another monologue, it might be 30%. And yeah, so I guess that's what I'm doing at the moment, is working out all of the components that are going to give me the content for the novel as I want it. Because what I do have already is the structure of the entire book. In the same way that when I was talking about this towards the start of last year, I eventually worked out the entire structure of Beach Surgery 1.0. I had the entire thing mapped out and still do. This new version of Beach Surgery, within which that 1.0 version is just one layer amongst three, I have those other two layers completely mapped out as well. They may change, they may grow, because there are some of them that I'm wondering exactly how I'm going to pull them off, but regardless, I'm really, really happy with the trajectory of the entire book. The structural things are great. It's just now about realising the very particular components that are going to be the building blocks to build up each of those monologues / chapters that will flesh out the structure and make it the book that it needs to be. Yeah, so that's what I've been thinking about and planning and working on. Tomorrow I'll keep working on that. I think I've got all the components for part 1 of the book. Part 2 of the book is quite different to part 1, so I need to work out which of the components will carry over and which of the components will be new and particular to part 2, and then I'll start to really structure them in place and start to write them, which is exciting, which I'm going to be doing quite soon. I did have a day the other week in which I did just sit down to write in this new voice, this new style I'm going for, and without meaning to, I initially thought I just wanted to write 200 words. I had a 200-word goal to describe a very particular thing, and it just ended up going to like a 4,000-word passage that had many different components in it just by virtue of writing and thinking about different things, and it all came together. And it was really, really a big thrill to see that come out in such a way. Having read it back since, I like it, but I recognise the need to do a little more pre-planning, and I'll be taking what I've written and saving some of the best parts of it to polish up and use as component building blocks for parts of this monologue. But as I was saying, I don't want to do bolting on of things later and a lot of tapestry work later. I do want to do more structural focus from the start and go from there. But I do recognise that it's always a back and forth, and the best intentions turn into completely other things that you then work on later. So yeah, that's where I'm at. Very happy about how it's going. I'll be back tomorrow morning, and I'll talk a bit more about how I've gone with the components of part 2, and yeah, see how things go from there. Have a good day. I'll see you next time.